Chapter 9 Part 3 Topics * Monroe Doctrine, continued. * The Broadway Railroad. * Advice to Governor Hill against the proposed enlargement of the Erie Canal. * Favors the bill for an international park and for the protection of the Adirondack forests. These passages were undoubtedly written by John Quincy Adams, and assented to and adopted by President Monroe. President Monroe had previously written to Mr. Jefferson asking his advice upon the subject, and requesting him to consult Mr. Madison. He had also sent to Mr. Jefferson a correspondence between Richard Rush, United States Minister at London, and George Canning, Foreign Secretary of State for Great Britain. Mr. Jefferson's reply was as follows: Monticello, October 24, 1823. Dear Sir, the question presented by the letters you have sent me is the most momentous which has ever been offered to my contemplation since that of independence. That made us a nation, this sets our compass and points the course which we are to steer through the ocean of time opening on us. And never could we embark upon it under any circumstances more auspicious. Our first and fundamental maxim should be, never to tangle ourselves in the broils of Europe. Our second, never to suffer Europe to intermeddle with cisatlantic affairs. America, North and South, has a set of interests distinct from those of Europe, and peculiarly her own. She should, therefore, have a system of her own, separate and apart from that of Europe. While the last is laboring to become the domicile of despotism, our endeavor should surely be to make our hemisphere that of freedom. One nation, most of all, could disturb us in this pursuit. She now offers to lead, aid, and accompany us in it. By acceding to her proposition we detach her from the bands, bring her mighty weight into the scale of free government, and emancipate a continent at one stroke, which might otherwise linger long in doubt and difficulty. Great Britain is the nation which can do us the most harm of any one of all on earth, and with her on our side we need not fear the whole world. With her, then, we should sedulously cherish a cordial friendship, and nothing would tend more to knit our affections than to be fighting once more side by side in the same cause. Not that I would purchase even her amity at the price of taking part in her wars. But the war in which the present proposition might engage us, should that be its consequence, is not her war, but ours. Its object is to introduce and establish the American system of keeping out of our land all foreign powers, of never permitting those of Europe to intermeddle with the affairs of our nations. It is to maintain our own principle, not to depart from it. And if, to facilitate this, we can effect a division in the body of the European powers, and draw over to our side its most powerful member, surely we should do it. But I am clearly of Mr. Canning's opinion that it will prevent instead of provoke war. With Great Britain withdrawn from their scale and shifted into that of our two continents, all Europe combined would not undertake such a war. For how would they propose to get at either enemy without superior fleets? Nor is the occasion to be slighted which this proposition offers, of declaring our protest against the atrocious violations of the rights of nations, by the interference of any one in the internal affairs of another, so flagitiously begun by Bonaparte, and now continued by the equally lawless alliance, calling itself holy. But we have first to ask ourselves a question: do we wish to acquire to our own confederacy any one or more of the Spanish provinces? I candidly confess that I have ever looked on Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our systems of states. The control which, with Florida Point, this island would give us over the Gulf of Mexico and the countries and isthmus bordering on it, as well as those whose waters flow into it, would fill up the measure of our political well-being. Yet, as I am sensible that this can never be obtained, even with her own consent, but by war, and its independence which is our second interests, and especially its independence of England, can be secured without it, I have no hesitation in abandoning my first wish to future chances, and accepting its independence, with peace and the friendship of England, rather than its association at the expense of war and her enmity. I could honestly, therefore, join in the declaration proposed, that we aim not at the acquisition of any of those possessions, that we will not stand in the way of any amicable arrangement between them and the mother country, but that we will oppose with all our means the forcible interposition of any other power, as auxiliary, stipendiary, or under any other form or pretext, and most especially their transfer to any power by conquest, cession, or acquisition in any other way. I should think it, therefore, advisable that the executive should encourage the British government to a continuance in the dispositions expressed in these letters by an assurance of his concurrence with them as far as his authority goes, and that it may lead to war, the declaration of which requires an act of Congress. The case shall be laid before them for consideration at their first meeting and under the reasonable aspect in which it is seen by himself. I have so long weaned from political subjects, and have so long ceased to take any interest in them, that I am sensible I am not qualified to offer opinions on them worthy of any attention. But the question now proposed involves consequences so lasting and effects so decisive of our future destinies as to rekindle all the interest I have heretofore felt on such occasions, and to induce me to the hazard of opinions which will prove only my wish to contribute still my might toward anything which may be useful to our country. And, praying you to accept it at only what it is worth, I add the assurance of my constant and affectionate friendship and respect. The general idea of keeping ourselves disentangled from the controversies and wars of European states was also contained in Washington's farewell address. The germ of the Monroe Doctrine will be found in several letters of Jefferson, one to Thomas Paine, dated March 18, 1801, another to William Short, dated October 3, 1801. Still later, a letter of Jefferson, dated October 29, 1808, said, "We consider their interests and ours as the same, and that the object of both must be to exclude all European influence in this hemisphere." Mr. Gallatin, the American minister to France, wrote to J.Q. Adams, Secretary of State, June 24, 1823, that before leaving Paris he had said to M. Chateaubriand, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, on May 13, the United States would undoubtedly preserve their neutrality, provided it were respected, and avoid every interference with the politics of Europe. On the other hand, they would not suffer others to interfere against the emancipation of America. Mr. John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, in his diary, under date of July 17, 1823, says that, in a conversation with Baron Tull, the Russian minister, he told him that we should contest the right of Russia to any territorial establishment on this continent, and that we should assume distinctly the principle that the American continents are no longer subjects for any new European colonial establishments. The reply of Mr. Madison was as follows. "Dear Sir, I have just received from Mr. Jefferson your letter to him, with the correspondence between Mr. Canning and Mr. Rush, sent for his and my perusal, and our opinions on the subject of it. From the disclosures of Mr. Canning it appears, as otherwise to be inferred, that the success of France against Spain would be followed by an attempt of the Holy Allies to reduce the revolutionized colonies of the latter to their former dependence. The professions we have made to these neighbors, our sympathies with their liberties and independence, the deep interest we have in the most friendly relations with them, and the consequences threatened by a command of their resources by the great powers, confederated against the rights and reforms of which we have given so conspicuous and persuasive an example, all unite in calling for our efforts to defeat the meditated crusade. It is particularly fortunate that the policy of Great Britain, though guarded by calculations different from ours, has presented cooperation for an object the same with ours. With the cooperation we have nothing to fear from the rest of Europe, and with it the best assurance of success to our laudable views. There ought not, therefore, to be any backwardness, I think, in meeting her in the way she has proposed, keeping in view, of course, the spirit and forms of the Constitution in every step taken in the road to war, which must be the last step if those short of war should be without avail. It cannot be doubted that Mr. Canning's proposal, though made with the air of consultation as well as concert, was founded on a predetermination to take the course marked out, whatever might be the reception given here to his invitation. But this consideration ought not to divert us from what is just and proper in itself. Our cooperation is due to ourselves and to the world, and while it must ensure success in the event of an appeal to force, it doubles the chance of success without that appeal. It is not improbable that Great Britain would like best to have the merit of being the sole champion of her new friends, notwithstanding the greater difficulty to be encountered, but for the dilemma in which she would be placed. She must, in that case, either leave us as neutrals, to extend our commerce and navigation at the expense of her, or make us enemies by renewing her paper blockades and other arbitrary proceedings on the ocean. It may be hoped that such a dilemma would not be without a permanent tendency to check her proneness to unnecessary wars. Why the British cabinet should have scrupled to arrest the calamity it now apprehends, by applying to the threats of France against Spain the small effort which it scruples not to employ in behalf of Spanish America, is best known to itself. It is difficult to find any other explanation that interest in the one case has more weight in its casuistry than principle had in the other. Will it not be honorable to our country, and possibly not altogether in vain, to invite the British government to extend the avowed disapprobation of the project against the Spanish colonies to the enterprise of France against Spain herself, and even to join in some declaratory act in behalf of the Greeks? On the supposition that no form could be given to the act clearing it of a pledge to follow it up by war, we ought to compare the good to be done with the little injury to be apprehended to the United States, shielded as their interests would be by the power and the fleets of Great Britain united with their own. These are questions, however, which may require more information than I possess, and more reflection than I can now give them. What is the extent of Mr. Canning's disclaimer as to the remaining possessions of Spain in America? Does it exclude future views of acquiring Puerto Rico, etc., as well as Cuba? It leaves Great Britain free, as I understand it, in relation to other quarters of the globe. I return the correspondence of Mr. Rush and Mr. Canning, with assurances, etc., J.M. To Thomas Jefferson, Montpelier, November 1, 1823. Dear Sir, I return the letter of the President. The correspondence from abroad has gone back to him as you desired. I have expressed to him my concurrence in the policy of meeting the advances of the British government, having an eye to the forms of our Constitution in every step in the road to war. With the British power and navy combined with our own, we have nothing to fear from the rest of the world, and in the great struggle of the epoch between liberty and despotism, we owe it to ourselves to sustain the former, in this hemisphere at least. I have even suggested an invitation to the British government to join in applying the small effort for so much good to the French invasion of Spain, and to make Greece an object of some such favorable attention. Why Mr. Canning and his colleague did not sooner interpose against the calamity, which could not have escaped foresight, cannot be otherwise explained but by the different aspect of the question when it related to liberty in Spain, and to the extension of British commerce to her former colonies. Mr. Canning was glad of the cooperation of the United States, but was too much devoted to the aggrandizement of England to accept President Monroe's declaration against the colonization of any portion of America by any European power. France and Russia likewise objected to that principle. The position taken by England, and especially the announcement by Mr. Canning that any attempt by France to aid Spain in the reconquest of her revolted colonies would be followed by the immediate acknowledgement by England of their independence, undoubtedly had great effect in defeating the plans of the Holy Alliance, and, indeed, of all schemes by European powers to appropriate to themselves any part of the former colonial dominions of Spain. But it was not until January, 1825, that England formally acknowledged the independence of the South American states. In announcing that event Mr. Canning gave way to his celebrated burst of oratory. I sought materials for compensation in another hemisphere. Contemplating Spain such as our ancestors had known her, I resolved that, if France had Spain, it should not be Spain with the Indies. I called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the Old. Thus the English statesman claimed credit for a result largely due to the assertion by the United States of the principle which has become so well known as the Monroe Doctrine. In the year 1884 Jacob Sharp, of New York City, succeeded in procuring from the legislature a charter for the construction of a surface railway through Broadway, then the most considerable and popular thoroughfare in New York City. It soon became notorious that the charter was obtained by the rankest corruption, and that the aldermen of New York City who gave effect to the charter were, with a few exceptions, paid largely for their votes. Mr. Tilden, through the press and through his private correspondence, urged upon the legislature its duty to repeal the charter at once. It was largely due to his exertions that the Railroad Committee of the Senate, early in March, reported that unanimously that the charter was obtained by fraud, that the organization was a sham, and concealed a scheme to appropriate to the personal benefit of a few desperate speculators the most valuable street railroad in the world without legal authority, without the consent of the property holders on Broadway, and without any adequate compensation to the city. Most of the articles which appeared in the leading New York journals during the latter days of the session of the legislature in 1886, urging the repeal of this charter, were dictated by Mr. Tilden. He also urged Governor Hill to support him in his efforts. The two letters which follow were written mainly to press this duty upon the governor. Tilden to Governor Hill, personal and confidential. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 20, 1886. Dear Governor Hill, I send you a series of papers. 1. The first is on the accountability of corporations, which shows the authority for a legislative repeal of the Broadway Railroad Charter. It is the same which I handed to you when you were at Greystone. I send it in connection with the papers which are now added. 2. The second paper is an authority from the Supreme Court of the United States showing the repealability of a street railroad charter, and its effect not only to vacate the charter, but also to vacate the franchise in a public street. 3. Papers 3, 4, 5, and 6 elicited by Mr. Carter's argument in behalf of the 7th Avenue Railroad Company, showing how the great organs of public opinion deal with the pretext of those who claim to be innocent holders, and as such entitled to indulgence and protection. The truth is, that on the facts as now disclosed there are no innocent holders, nor any holders who had not sufficient information to put them on their guard against the stock and bonds tainted with fraud and corruption. Least of all can the 7th Avenue Company set up any such preference. In the first place, the notoriety of the grounds of suspicion and fraud and corruption which has attended the transaction from its beginning, and which carried moral conviction to the whole public, is sufficient to deprive any purchaser of the character of an innocent investor, and to convict him of engaging in the transaction at his voluntary risk. In the second place, the omission of a compliance with the legal conditions necessary to a valid organization of the Broadway Railroad Company, and the legal conditions necessary to the existence of the right to construct the railroad, the failure to give adequate notice of the meeting of the aldermen at which the grant was carried over the mayor's veto, which rendered the action of the Board of Aldermen giving their consent totally void, and other legal irregularities, were all things which the purchaser of stock and bonds was bound to inquire into. The 7th Avenue Company, so far from being an innocent holder, was the active principal in the whole transaction. It controlled the disposal of the stock and bonds, and leased in perpetuity the Broadway Railroad. If any other party afterwards bought stock or bonds, he would acquire no better title than 7th Avenue Railroad Company had, and could communicate. If he has been cheated, his remedy lies on the guarantee of the 7th Avenue Railroad Company, or otherwise against that company. He has no equity against the defrauded city to indemnify him against his own laches. The interests of public morality require that the holders of the booty, whether at first or second hand, should not be allowed to carry it off triumphantly. You are the representative of the Democratic Party of the state of New York. It is necessary that the purpose to defeat this conspiracy of fraud, corruption, and public robbery should be conspicuously manifested by you. The more effectual and the more swift the measures of redress are, the greater will be the popular approval. An accessory measure would be to take away from the alderman the power to pass any grant over a mayor's veto. A single man standing up before the face of the community would never make such a grant. The Cantor Bill, as amended, ought to pass, but it is imperfect, and the additional legislation ought to be applied. It can be added to, or its operation limited, hereafter. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Tilden to Governor Hill. Personal and confidential. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 24, 1886. Dear Governor Hill, your special message is admirable. Such action is the best answer to those who depreciated you in the last canvass. I was not mistaken in thinking it would be received with general popular applause. But you have now to follow up the issue which you have so well made, and, if possible, conduct your side of it to complete success. I have always regarded President Cleveland's advertisement that he did not desire to influence the action of Congress as a great mistake. A public man must show not only that he is individually, though impotently, right, but that he can lead his party followers and make them, and be himself, to the largest practicable extent, a power for good. Otherwise, when he comes to be judged, it will be said that he is better than his party, but must be discarded because he cannot effect results. I hope, therefore, you will exert all the moral influence you possess to induce the legislature to pass such legislation as you recommend. I think a law ought to be enacted at the consent of the local authorities of the City of New York to the laying down of a railroad track in any street of the said city shall not be made effectual by the vote of any alderman if the resolution giving such consent shall have been vetoed by the mayor of the said city, or without the assent of a majority in interest of owners of property abutting on the said street. The streets in the City of New York are already well provided with north and south railroads, so that a man need walk but 1 block, and generally but half a block, in order to reach one of these railroads, and very little room is left for the convenience of vehicles other than railroad cars. Additional lines should only be granted after great deliberation and the fullest public discussion. The Fifth Avenue should be kept clear as an access to the Central Park. On the east side of it, Madison, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd Avenues have each a horse railroad, and the 3rd and 2nd have elevated railroads. On the west side the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th Avenues and Broadway have each a horse railroad, and 6th and 9th Avenues have each elevated railroad. Nothing is left except 5th Avenue, most of Lexington Avenue and Broadway below 14th Street. The cable railroad would take Lexington Avenue, cutting through Gramercy Park, which is maintained by the adjacent owners without cost to the city. These facts are sufficient to show that no harm can come from imposing the restraints suggested. The abuse of the power of the alderman to give the consent of the local authorities against the veto of the mayor shows that such power ought to be taken away. The improvidence attending the appointment of commissioners by general term empowered to dispense with the consent of the abutting property owners shows that such authority ought to be taken away. But, of course, the great measure is to repeal the Broadway Railroad Charter and the franchise of that company, if it has in reality acquired that franchise to run a street railroad in Broadway. I do not know that you will be able to accomplish all that is desirable, but there is no harm in submitting the foregoing suggestions for your considerations. Since writing the above, I have received the printed copy of the message. Very truly yours, Samuel J. Tilden. Learning that I was expecting to meet Mr. Roscoe Conkling, then acting as counsel for the Broadway property holders for the repeal of the charter, Mr. Tilden addressed me the following letter. Tilden to Bigelow, personal and confidential, Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 21, 1886. Dear Mr. Bigelow, if you see Mr. Conkling, I wish you would suggest to him, in case he frames remedial bills for the Senate Committee, the high expediency of a bill taking away the power of the Board of Aldermen to pass an act over the mayor's veto, giving the consent of the local authorities to the laying down of railroad tracks in any street in the City of New York. The bill should also impose the condition requiring the consent of a majority in interests of the owners of property abutting on every street in which such tracks are proposed to be laid down. The bill should also require that the franchise of running such railroad should be sold at auction, for a gross sum, to be paid in cash for the benefit of the sinking fund of the City of New York. The necessity of the provision taking away the power of the Board of Aldermen to pass a grant over the mayor's veto is quite obvious. Then requiring the separate consent of the mayor will be effectual. No mayor will defy the general public opinion, or consent to an improvident or corrupt act. The propriety of taking away the power of the general term by appointing commissioners and confirming their action, to overcome the restraint created by the disapproval or antagonism of the property owners, is shown by the evidence taken by the Senate committee, illustrating the improvidence, favoritism, or collusion which attended the recent appointment or improper persons as commissioners. The sale of the franchise for a gross sum instead of a percentage on the gross or net income of the railroad will be alone effectual to secure the city a just compensation. In one contest the city may triumph, but in a continuing contest for annual payments, to be annually ascertained and collected, the city will sooner or later be beaten. If any credit should be given, that should be only on first mortgage bonds deposited in the sinking fund. Even that is not altogether safe. If the grant is valuable, the grantee may as well raise the money and pay it into the sinking fund. That system will be free from afterclaps. One word in respect to the Broadway Railroad grant. The interest of public morality and official fidelity and honor cannot afford to have Mr. Conkling beaten in his present professional crusade. It is of great importance that the present case should be an example of public justice, and not of successful villainy. Mr. Conkling's professional reputation will be greatly enhanced by his success in defeating the conspiracy of plunder. This cannot be done by paltering in half measures. The exercise of the indubitable power of the legislature to repeal the Broadway charter, which would carry with it the annulment of the franchise to run the road, but which had better be expressed in the bill, is the only proper measure. Public opinion strongly and unanimously demands this remedy. The sham of pretended innocent holders deceives nobody. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, May 6, 1886. Dear Sir, I am honored by your invitation to attend and address the Grand Mass meeting at the Academy of Music, on Friday evening, May 7. The delicate state of my health will prevent me from complying with your invitation. I cordially and earnestly concur with you in desiring to give the most imposing expression of the approval, admiration, and applause with which America regards the magnificent effort of the Premier of Great Britain to consummate and crown his career of illustrious services to mankind, by giving the blessings of Home Rule to the long misgoverned people of Ireland. The voice of America speaks in the place of the voice of posterity. It is inspired by the best hopes of a genuine human progress which may redeem past errors of England towards Ireland, and the false policy towards other peoples which has cost England so dear. Next to the renowned Gladstone, the need of gratitude is due to Parnell for so signal an advance of the cause of local self-government among mankind. Your fellow citizen, Samuel J. Tilden. Honorable John Fox, Chairman Subcommittee. There were two bills being pressed on the legislature in the interest of rogues at the session of 1885 and 1886, both of which Mr. Tilden exerted all his influence, and with success, to defeat. Their character and his view of them will appear in the following letter to the Governor, confidential. Greystone, June 16, 1886. Dear Governor Hill, I infer from what Mr. Green tells me that you feel the burden of resisting the pressure of the advocates of the bill pretending to complete the abolition of imprisonment for debt, and of the bill appropriating $200,000 for doubling the length of the locks on the Erie Canal. In respect to the first of these bills, in my judgment, the clamor in its favor is confined to a very few persons who have been imposed upon by scoundrels seeking to get a legislative pardon for their offenses. It is superficial and will not endure discussion. The bill is artfully worded so as to destroy what Mr. O'Connor and myself thought to be the most valuable instrument which the laws afford for the punishment of great acts of public robbery. If the existing law needs to be made more lenient in some cases, that should be done by a carefully framed bill which should do no general mischief. If you veto this bill you will be successfully defended, and will add to your reputation as a watchful guardian of the public interests. In respect to the other bill, its immediate effect will be the waste of $200,000 of the public money, but its ultimate effect will be to enter upon an immense expenditure and the creation of new canal rings. You will have, sooner or later, to arrest the system or discredit your administration. I think a pitched battle on the subject would in the long run do you good instead of harm, but I admit that a considerable public opinion has been artificially created in its favor. I have twice destroyed a similar scheme. But if you think it expedient to defer the contest until the public mind can be better educated, though if were my case I should make it now, you can let this bill pass with less permanent harm that the first mentioned bill would produce. If the state has already borrowed or authorized the borrowing of $1 million for the Niagara Falls Park, or for that and other purposes, amounting in the aggregate to $1 million, this act would be a violation of Section 10 of Article 7 of the Constitution. Perhaps a simple statement of this objection, if it exist, would be the easiest way to dispose of this bill and of adjourning the discussion. I would not trouble myself if I had not sincere and deep solicitude for the welfare of your administration. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Among Mr. Tilden's papers was found a document endorsed, copy of Notes on the Canals, written by Mr. Tilden on September 4 and 5, 1885, in answer to queries addressed to him. I presume the original was sent to someone in the legislature who was conducting the war upon the canal enlarging scheme referred to in the preceding letter. There is probably no American now living who knows as much about the New York canal system or interior waterway economics of all kinds as Mr. Tilden did. The questions to which these notes reply are as vital today as they ever were, for the Constitutional Convention of New York in 1894 rashly broke down the barriers wisely erected by the Convention of 1846, and successfully guarded by Tilden as legislator, governor, and counselor for 40 years, and has placed the people once more at the mercy of a new canal ring, which is rapidly taking shape again under its auspices. I may here remark incidentally that I have reason to believe that it was largely in deference to Mr. Tilden's advice that Governor Hill gave his approval also to the bill for the protection of the Adirondack forests and the International Park Bill. Notes on the Canals, 1884-5. 1. Would not the expense of deepening the canal, so as to add 2 feet to the depth of water, be very great? I understand that now for a great part of its course the bottom of the canal is composed for about a foot of clay and hydraulic cement, packed closely, so as to prevent breakage, and would not expense of taking this up, and replacing it after the bottom was dug up, be more serious than any calculation has yet allowed? The idea of increasing the depth of the canal 2 feet is a gross exaggeration of what is possible or proper to do. To build up the banks 2 feet would necessitate building up the locks. To excavate the bottom 2 feet would be impracticable. Note, the following is the provision which opens the door of the public treasury to the new canal ring, Article 7, Section 10. The canals may be improved in such manner as the legislature shall provide by law. A debt may be authorized for that purpose in the mode prescribed by Section 4 of this article, or the cost of such improvement may be defrayed by the appropriation of funds from the state treasury, or by equitable annual tax. At page 23 of my message for 1875, it was stated, the waterway was practically never excavated in every part to its proper dimensions. Time, the action of the elements, and neglect of administration, all tend to fill it by deposits. There is no doubt that the sides of the waterway have been changed and the slope filled in with silt, narrowing the bottom of the canal so that it is only in the middle that the proper depth is approached, and inconvenience is felt in one boat passing another. My suggestion was to bring up the canal to an honest 7 feet. All the structures of the canal were adapted to that. Bring it up to 7 feet, honest 7 feet, and on all levels, wherever you can, bottom it out. Throw the excavation upon the banks, increase that 7 feet toward 8 feet, as you can do so progressively and economically, you may take out the bench walls. This suggestion looked to gaining on the long levels, when it was found practicable, some inches increasing 7 feet toward 8 feet. The suggestion was carefully limited, because in many places you cannot change the bottom without interfering with culverts or carrying the excavation below the miter sills of the locks. As to the capacity of the Erie, the lockages at Frankfort during the season of 1884 were 20,800. The lockages in 1873 were stated, on page 22 of my message of 1875, to have been 24,960. The theoretical capacity of the canal will be 3 or 4 times the largest tonnage it has reached. There is no doubt it can conveniently and easily do double the business which has ever existed, even though the locks be not manned and worked with the highest efficiency. If that was true when the lockages were 25,000, how much more so is it when the lockages have fallen to 20,800, as in 1884? 2. How far does the fact that the lake transportation has almost entirely passed into the hands of railroad people affect the probability of increasing the business of the canal, in case it should be deepened? 3. Can the canal be maintained in the face of the increasing railroad competition? Total tons of each class of articles which came to the Hudson River from Erie and Champlain Canal. The railroads have competed successfully with the Erie Canal and have carried off all the increase in the tonnage. Notwithstanding the state has ceased to charge tolls, and has imposed an annual tax of $700,000 upon the taxpayers to maintain the canals, the Erie Canal has failed to keep up its business. It holds on to a portion of the lumber and of the grain. There seems to be no probability that the Erie Canal will regain any portion of the business it has lost. None of the grand schemes by which it is proposed to enlarge or improve it can to any appreciable extent cheapen the transportation. They will simply waste the money of the taxpayer and revive the system of contracting, jobbery, and fraud. The advantage of lengthening the lock so as to pass 2 boats at once, where there is plenty of time to pass 4 times the boats which the tonnage requires, is doubtful and is at best inconsiderable. It can only pretend to save 5 minutes in a lockage, if in fact, it will save any time. Unless some effectual expedient be adopted to prevent the waste of water in locking through a single boat, it would consume 3 times as much water in the long lock as in the short lock. I understand that the superintendent thinks that ruinous mischief can be avoided, but I have had no means of testing how the thing would work in practice. In 1867, when I examined the subject, I found that on the Delaware and Raritan they used boats of about the same dimensions as the boats in use on the Erie, notwithstanding the locks were capable of passing 2 boats at a time. I send my message of 1875, my speech in the Constitutional Convention of 1867, which contains a fuller discussion of the subject. I send also the last report of the Superintendent of Public Works on the canals. The statistical tables are so changed from the ancient forms that it is difficult to get the materials for a satisfactory comparison of the present with the former business. A certain portion of the business naturally belongs to the railroads. The principles which govern this division are set forth in the beginning of my speech in 1867. The business would naturally be divided and the share of the railroads would be increased as the network of the railroads is perfected and more points are touched. Besides, the railroads will compete for additional business at less than cost, charging the loss upon the paying portion of their traffic. On the whole, it must be observed within the last 10 years the cost of transportation by railroads has been reduced 1/2. All the improvements tending to cheapen transportation are made by the railroads. Note, of this amount 5,147,660 tons is the tonnage for 12 months of the New York Y, P, and O, R. Company, abbreviated for New York, Pennsylvania and Ohio Railroad, was organized from the bankrupt Atlantic and Great Western Railroad in March 1880 and leased by the Erie. As to the clamor about diverting traffic to the Canadian lines, it is senseless. The great mass of grain brought from the West is for local consumption. 2.5 millions of people residing in the city of New York and its suburbs are not going to bring the grain for their own consumption by way of Montreal. A large share of the flour and grain carried by the New York Central is for local consumption in New England. Formerly it came to New York City and was distributed from that point. It is now carried direct. For instance, flour grain for consumption at Springfield and Worcester are carried from the point of shipment in the West direct to those places without change of cars. They cannot be diverted. The Erie Canal still has a certain utility. It should be nursed along, but without any expectation of regaining the place it once occupied in the transportation of the country. The taxpayer of this state will not always consent to pay a bonus of $700,000 per year in order to get tonnage for the Erie Canal. In the year 1886 the Albany Argus proposed to celebrate its bicentennial birthday. Mr. James H. Manning, the son of his old friend the late Secretary of the Treasury and representative of his interest in the paper, asked Mr. Tilden to make a contribution to its bicentennial number. In response to this appeal Mr. Tilden sent the following letter. Greystone, June 30, 1886. Dear Mr. James H. Manning, I have received your note asking me to contribute to the bicentennial number of the Argus. You are about to publish something concerning the old city of Albany and the days I spent there. I was in Albany between 9 and 10 months of the year 1846 as a member of the Assembly, and member of the Constitutional Convention held in that year, and again most of the summer of 1867 as a member of the Constitutional Convention held in that year, and again most of the winter of 1872 as a member of the Assembly, and again the 2 years of 1875 and 1876 as governor. On all these occasions life in Albany was characterized by the polite and liberal hospitality which I have sometimes heard ascribed to inheritance from the good old Dutch customs and manners. I was occasionally in Albany during the 10 years preceding 1846, so that I have some recollections extending back at least 50 years. The city has greatly changed during that time. I used to often to walk through the part of Albany called the Colony to see the old Dutch houses, of which many specimens then existed. Their gables fronted on the street, the edges of their roofs ascending by notches like saw teeth, and their entrances being in the corner through doors horizontally cut into 2 parts. My father lived in New Lebanon, about 23 miles east of Albany, and was in frequent communication and correspondence with the political notabilities of Albany on the Democratic side from the days of Governor Tompkins to more recent times. In my youth, at my father's house I saw most of the leaders of the Democratic Party of the state and some of the leaders of the nation. But as I am contributing to the bicentennial number of the Argus, I must not forget the journalists. I distinctly remember seeing at my father's house Solomon Southwick, Jesse Buell, and often Edwin Croswell, all famous journalists in their day. As I am dictating on the last day when you can receive the contribution you ask, and doing it in great haste, I will conclude with a reminiscence touching a part of Albany County, which went for independence before July 4, 1776. The locality in which I was born, now in the town New Lebanon, Columbia County, New York, was at the time of my birth embraced was in the town of Canaan, which until 1788 was a part of King's District, a subdivision created in 1772, of the county of Albany. The people of King's District before and during the Revolution acted as a little republic. The town meeting was its organ. The records of the town contain the following proceedings: at a meeting of the inhabitants of the county of Albany, legally warned by the committee of said county at the house of William Warner, innkeeper, in said district, on Monday the 24th day of June, 1776, for the purpose of electing 12 delegates to represent said county in the provincial congress, be voted. First, that Daniel Buck be moderator of this meeting. Second, that the present committee's clerk be clerk of this meeting. Third, that the district's books be delivered to the care of said committee's clerk until the next district meeting. Fourth, that a committee be chosen by this meeting for the purpose of drawing up instructions for a new form of government to be introduced by said delegates. The question being put, whether the said district chooses to have the United American Colonies independent of Great Britain, voted unanimously in the affirmative. History of Columbia County, page 322. King's District was mainly settled by emigrants from Connecticut, and its settlers fought for their country during the Revolution by levies en masse. Signed, S. J. Tilden. This concludes Part 3 and Chapter 9. Please share, like and subscribe. Audio chapters will be produced into a documentary series. Additionally, a live podcast is in the plans to discuss Tilden and the first 100 years of American history.